children, right? We're talking about a culture. Again, I'm not talking about just Palestinians. I'm talking about the Muslim community worldwide in dozens of countries that has produced a seemingly unending supply of suicide bombers over the last 50 years, right? We're talking about societies where phenomenon that should be impossible are simply to be expected. I mean, literally like rigging children to explode. Just that. I mean, think of how deranging that is for an army or a police force or an NGO or anyone to have to imagine that a child isn't simply a child, but a child might, in fact, under certain circumstances, be a bomb.
In a world full of noise and denial, this moment stood out. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. When will people understand that you cannot reason with jihadists? That single line from Sam Harris froze the room. It wasn't rhetoric, Wham, it was reality. You can't negotiate with those who glorify death as devotion or reason with an ideology that sees destruction as sacred. When he said Hamas are jihadists, he wasn't targeting a religion. He was naming a mindset, a movement built on martyrdom, not peace. And as Piers Morgan listened, you could almost feel the air shift. Harris wasn't arguing politics. He was confronting an idea that rejects reason itself.
Involving several people. One was Mossab Hassam Youssef. He's the son of one of the Hamas co-founders who then renounced Hamas and moved away. And he said this about what's going on at the moment in the Israel-Gaza war. Let's take a listen.
Any person who put the religious identity above the highest interest of humanity, I have no respect for this people. The majority of the Muslim people identified with Hamas, supported Hamas. Show me how many Muslims out there who condemned Hamas genocide.
What was interesting about that is that he was really suggesting that the motivating factor behind what Hamas did and why people are supporting them in such big numbers in the Muslim community is because they're Muslims. It's religion-driven. Now, you're an atheist, but what do you think of that, of this idea that it's actually really about religion?
Well, I'm going to agree with him. I think it's interesting to note that many of your listeners will doubt my ability to make the statements of a sort I'm now going to make, but they can't doubt that of him, right? I mean, he obviously knows whereof he speaks, right? You can't play the identity politics game with him and say that, you know, he doesn't understand the culture, he's the wrong skin color, he doesn't speak the language, et cetera, et cetera. So let's flag that particular qualm with what I'm going to say. What I'm going to say is it should just be obvious to everyone, which is that we have a vast number of people in the Muslim community worldwide, not just in the occupied territories or in Gaza, who are powerfully deranged by religious symbols and their religious identity, which is to say it is the most important thing to them, but more important even than the deaths of their own children, right? We're talking about a culture. Again, I'm not talking about just Palestinians. I'm talking about the Muslim community worldwide in dozens of countries that has produced a seemingly unending supply of suicide bombers over the last 50 years, right? We're talking about societies where phenomenon that should be impossible are simply to be expected. I mean, literally like rigging children to explode. Just that. I mean, think of how deranging that is for an army or a police force or an NGO or anyone to have to imagine that a child isn't simply a child, but a child might, in fact, under certain circumstances, be a bomb, right? I mean, that is the situation we're in. We're talking about a society, and now I'm talking about the Gaza and the West Bank in particular, where in their schools they teach 6-year-olds the love of martyrdom, the literal aspiration to die as a martyr, and the hatred of Jews. And many of these schools are UN funded, right? So this is a terrifying situation which the world has simply acquiesced to. I mean, the world on some level has simply accepted that there is a different standard held to the Muslim community, right? We all understand that you can stage a play making fun of Mormonism on Broadway and it can become the biggest musical in the United States, the Book of Mormon. But to stage such a play about Islam would be unthinkable, and to be unthinkable not because the First Amendment doesn't protect the freedom of speech with respect to Islam, it does, but that protection has been forfeited. It was forfeited long ago because of the tendency in the Muslim community to erupt with just psychopathic rage in response to what it perceives to be the desecration of religious symbols. And that should be intolerable to us. But it's, we have acquiesced to it. And the new norm is there are certain things you can't say about Islam. There are certain symbols you can't traduce. And it's because we know that tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people will march into the streets, even in the capitals of Europe, in response to those blasphemies.
Could you flip the argument the other way too? Some people would say that the scale, the disproportionate, as many see it, scale of Israel's response is motivated in some part, again, by a religious motivation, that some of the more hardline, ultra-religious members of Netanyahu's cabinet really do want to have some kind of genocidal war with the Muslim Palestinians. I mean, does it work both ways?
Well, it does work both ways when you're talking about a tiny minority of Jews in Israel. I mean, the ultra-Orthodox, the settlers the minority of settlers who are motivated by their religious fanaticism. I think those religious claims upon real estate in the Middle East are not justified, and they aren't, in fact, part of the problem. And so, yes, the settlements in the West Bank are certainly provocative, and they should be disallowed, right? If we were ever going to get to a two-state solution, part of the remedy there is to disenfranchise the religious maniacs on the Israeli side. But in terms of the scale of the problem, it is orders of magnitude smaller. I mean, not just for that particular region, but for the whole world. I mean, we're talking, there are 15 million Jews on earth. Most of them are impressively secular. Most believe very little that would motivate a person to want to die for their religious identity. The real justification.
Yeah, I just on that, I would just say, I just wonder whether you think that what is going on now in Gaza, the kind of obliteration of a lot of Gaza, the mass killing of civilians and so on, which Israel will justify by saying they're trying to get rid of a terror group. I understand the thinking, but the execution has been so increasingly indiscriminate that is there not a danger that it actually massively increases the radicalization problem rather than remove it?
Well, there's two pieces to that answer. One is that the real problem of radicalization, I would say, is not connected in any kind of rational way to real world grievances, right? I mean, so the real problem of radicalization is the level of ideas, right? Ideas around martyrdom and jihad that easily cross borders, and as we saw with the Islamic State, can easily win recruits from 100 countries. I mean, so you literally have people who have no discernible grievance against anyone. I mean, you have somebody dropping out of medical school in London going to fight with the Islamic State purely on the power of certain ideas, right? So that's a larger problem of jihadism and specific religious beliefs that are endemic to Islam, and that it is taboo to criticize. If you're a Muslim, you certainly risk your life and with charges of apostasy and blasphemy if you criticize these ideas. But specifically with Gaza, I mean, the killing of innocents in Gaza is an absolute tragedy, and it's very easy to understand why people seeing that imagery think that Israel is in the wrong for producing so many casualties. But they are fighting a terrorist organization, a jihadist organization, that is using its own civilian population as human shields. It has strategically embedded itself among civilians. It wears civilian clothing, right? It put its headquarters under a hospital. It prevents civilians from leaving to safer areas because it wants to produce carnage, because carnage is an advantage in this PR war against Israel. And frankly, these people sincerely believe in paradise. They think that good Muslims are going to go to paradise wherever they die, however they die. And so there is, in fact, no problem with this carnage, right? And that's the thing that is very difficult for secular people to get their heads around, that people actually believe these things. When members of Hamas chant, "We love death more than the Jews love life," that is a sincere expression of their worldview, right? It's not propaganda. It's not posturing. It is a confession of a psychological state of mind and of a worldview. And we doubt that at our peril, right? I mean, this is the issue. We're dealing with a suicidal death cult that doesn't care about its own civilian casualties. In fact, its own civilian casualties are an additional advantage for it.
Sam Harris, great to talk to you again. I really appreciate you coming on and speaking with such clarity about a complex issue.
Sam Harris summed up something I've been saying nonstop for a week. This isn't mainly about bad conditions, it's about ideas. Piers pushed back with the obvious worry. If civilians are being slaughtered and entire neighborhoods flattened, won't that fuel the next wave of recruits? Won't the destruction itself create a fresh generation of killers? Harris's answer was blunt and important. No, it's not the rubble that does the recruiting, it's the ideology. People aren't deciding to strap on explosives because they saw a smashed house. They're answering a story, a set of beliefs that valorize martyrdom, glorify jihad, and promise honor or paradise for those who die fighting the state of Israel. That's why you see bewildering examples, students in London or medical trainees in Britain abandoning everything to join groups like ISIS. Their lives aren't ruined by local grievances, they're swept up by an idea that crosses borders and social classes. So yes, conditions and grievances matter politically, but they're not the engine here. The engine is a powerful worldview, religious and historical narratives combined, that motivates people regardless of whether they live next door to the conflict or thousands of miles away. Look at the pattern. Many of the people loudly chanting death to Israel, burning flags, stomping on symbols, they're not all living next door to the fighting. Tehran, Cairo, Algiers, places far from Gaza, still see fierce demonstrations. That tells you something obvious and uncomfortable. This is driven by ideas, not simply by broken living conditions. This isn't a convenient excuse to blame outsiders for everything. It's a call to be honest. Too often the response is, what did Israel do to make them do this? As if every act of violence needs a neat causal trigger tied to policy or poverty. Sometimes the motivating force is built into an ideology, narratives of martyrdom, historical grievance, and a political theology that imagines domination rather than coexistence. Those beliefs aren't whispered in private. They're declared, repeated, and at times encoded in official rhetoric. Critics point to violent imagery and apocalyptic language in some of the movement's texts and statements as evidence that destruction of the Jewish state is part of the stated aim. So don't reduce this to a simple tale of poverty or revenge. When the call to violence is embedded in an ideology, when martyrdom is glorified and the annihilation of an opponent is openly celebrated, we have to name it for what it is. Ideology, not circumstances.